At 5:30 a.m. on May the 10th, 1940, Adolf Hitler launched his long-awaited Western offensive, codenamed Case Yellow. This was the moment for which both the Germans and the Allies had been preparing since the previous September. The campaign which followed would see the Germans achieve one of the most stunning victories in the annals of warfare. In the Battle of France, the German army deployed the greatest concentration of tanks ever assembled. Their offensive saw the war's first large-scale airborne operation. Already victorious in Poland and Norway, the Germans would now be meeting forces equal to their own in both manpower and material. Yet with new and revolutionary tactics, the Germans would destroy the armies of Belgium, Holland, and France, and inflict upon the British Army its greatest humiliation since its defeat in the American Revolution. The German campaign would leave Hitler as undisputed master of Western Europe and give his army an aura of invincibility. So complete was its victory that 4 years would pass before Germany's supremacy in France and the Low Countries could again be challenged. On March the 12th, 1938, Hitler sent his army into Austria and annexed it to the Reich. Though the invasion openly flouted international law, neither Britain nor France made any protest. Encouraged by his victory, Hitler turned his attention toward Czechoslovakia. He began demanding the return of the Sudetenland, a Czech region inhabited by ethnic Germans. International tension over the issue mounted steadily to the point where war seemed certain. Eventually, in September 1938, the leaders of France, Britain, Germany, and Italy met at Munich to resolve the crisis. Eager at all costs to avoid war, the Western powers yielded to all of Hitler's demands. The Czechs were given no say in the carving up of their country. Britain hoped that peace in Europe was now assured and that Hitler would pose no further threat. This illusion was shattered within 6 months, when in March 1939, the Germans occupied the rump of Czechoslovakia. Britain was outraged and promptly abandoned its policy of appeasement. On the 31st of March, Britain and France promised to guarantee the independence of Poland, where it seemed Hitler would strike next. Just 3 days later, Hitler ordered his generals to draw up plans for Poland's destruction. His main objective was to regain territories ceded to the Poles after the Great War. He felt sure the Allies would not actually go through with their threat to fight. In August 1939, he stunned world opinion by signing a non-aggression pact with the Soviet Union, his most hated enemy. A secret clause in the pact arranged for the partition of Poland between the two powers. With Russian complicity thus assured, Hitler massed 59 divisions along the Polish borders and prepared to launch them in converging attacks. The German formations included over 2,500 tanks and 2,000 Luftwaffe fighters and bombers. The Polish forces facing them were spread out all along the 1,750 miles of the frontiers with Germany. They comprised 7 armies, totaling 30 active divisions and 10 reserve divisions. They also possessed 12 large cavalry brigades, 475 tanks, and 445 aircraft. On September the 1st, Hitler's armies surged across the Polish frontiers. In the north, the German Third Army advanced from East Prussia and the Fourth Army from Pomerania. In the south, 8th and 10th Armies attacked from Silesia and 14th Army from Slovakia. By the 5th of September, 4th Army had secured the Danzig corridor and was moving southeast alongside 3rd Army. By the 7th of September, 10th Army had advanced northeast to within 30 miles of Warsaw, cutting off Polish forces before they could reach the River Vistula. The main basis of German success in Poland was an entirely new tactic which came to be called Blitzkrieg, or Lightning War. Blitzkrieg relied on the deployment of armoured forces in entire divisions. These panzer divisions consisted of both light and heavy tanks, motorised infantry, artillery and reconnaissance units. Once the massed heavy tanks had punched their way through enemy defences, the breach would be consolidated and widened by the following wave of light tanks and infantry. The forward units continued their advance, carrying the battle into enemy rear areas. A key element in Blitzkrieg was the close ground support provided by the Luftwaffe, whose airstrikes helped isolate frontline forces and cut them off from any logistic support. In the skies over Poland, the Luftwaffe rapidly achieved total aerial supremacy. Attacks against Polish airfields wiped out a large portion of the Polish Air Force on the first day of the war. The Luftwaffe struck hard at key military installations, supply lines, and rail networks. Indeed, the Germans were all too familiar with the layout of the Polish railway system, having built it themselves. On the 10th of September, the Poles began a general retreat toward the southeast of their country. On the 15th of September, the German Third Army completed its northern pincer movement. 4th and 14th Armies completed the encirclement from the east by September the 17th. Poland's fate was sealed when, on that same day, some 41 Russian divisions crossed her near-defenseless eastern frontiers. By September the 23rd, they had effortlessly occupied the zone allotted to them under the Nazi-Soviet pact. Meanwhile, the Germans mopped up the final pockets of resistance. Overwhelmed by ferocious Luftwaffe bombing raids, Warsaw finally surrendered at 2 p.m. on September the 27th. The German victory had been achieved with the loss of only 44,000 casualties, compared to total Polish losses of nearly 1 million in killed, wounded, and captured. 2 days after the launch of the Polish invasion, France and Britain, in line with their earlier guarantees, declared war on Germany. However, Poland's geographical location and the swiftness of the German victory prevented them from intervening directly. The French briefly advanced across Germany's western border, but upon hearing of Poland's defeat, they withdrew. In September, the first detachments of the British Expeditionary Force, or BEF, began taking up positions along the Franco-Belgian border. By the end of the month, 13 British divisions were in place, numbering over 150,000 men. 21,000 vehicles accompanied the BEF to France, along with almost all of Britain's heavy military equipment. The French and British troops dug in and waited for the expected German attack in the west. No attack came, and for the next 8 months, hostilities would be limited to sporadic artillery duels and bombing raids. The next major German offensive was directed not at France, but Scandinavia. In April 1940, German troops moved to occupy Denmark and Norway. They were sent to protect Germany's supplies of iron ore, which were shipped out from Sweden through the Norwegian port of Narvik. By occupying Norway, Germany would also secure bases for air attacks against Allied shipping in the North Sea and keep the Royal Navy from the Baltic. The Allies had already realized that severing Germany's iron ore supply would cripple the Nazi war machine, and they were simultaneously planning their own operation in Norway. The Germans narrowly won the ensuing race. On April the 9th, German troops landed at Kristiansund, Bergen, Trondheim, and Narvik. Supporting airborne assaults were made against Oslo and Stavanger. This was the first major air-land-sea operation in history. On the same day, and in the space of 4 hours, the Germans occupied Denmark. By April the 16th, Germany controlled most of southern Norway. Despite heroic resistance, Norway's largely militia army had been unable to prevent the German capture of their coastal cities. Over the next 3 days, British and French troops landed at Namsos, Narvik, and Andelsnes. In the south, they advanced as far as Lillehammer, but were then repulsed and had to be withdrawn by early May. In the north, they pushed the Germans out of Narvik. However, the Allied campaign was doomed by poor coordination, especially between the navy and infantry, while the total air supremacy achieved by the Luftwaffe proved decisive. The outcome of the Norwegian campaign was a foregone conclusion. Even before the fighting had finished there, the Germans were preparing to launch their greatest gamble of all, the invasion and conquest of the West. After his lightning conquest of Poland, Hitler had hoped the Allies would accept the German victory, just as they had earlier accepted the occupation of Austria and Czechoslovakia. Once he saw they were determined to fight, he had resolved to launch a Western offensive as soon as possible. He knew the Allies would need time to mobilize fully and to draw on the resources of their overseas colonies. If given this time, they would be too strong for Germany to defeat. It was essential, therefore, that the German army should attack while it still had the initiative. His first strategic priority was to defeat the French army in the field. Once this was achieved, he felt confident that Britain would sue for peace. Much of Hitler's military outlook had been shaped by his time as a frontline soldier on the Western Front during the Great War. Many of his generals had been staff or artillery officers during World War I, and as such would not have fought in the trenches. On this basis, Hitler distrusted their opinions and frequently overruled them. Indeed, all his military initiatives to date had been taken against the express advice of the High Command. Each one of these had succeeded, and for Hitler, these successes amounted to victories over his own generals as well as the enemy. Hitler's decision to go to war with Britain and France deeply dismayed his commanders. They neither shared his grand ambitions of conquest, nor believed the army was strong enough to realize them. Their opposition to Hitler was weakened after his run of successes. The High Command was also indebted to him for restoring the army's power and prestige. Hitler could also count on the support of the rank and file, who hero-worshipped him. By the spring of 1940, Hitler's leadership was secure, and the army's loyalty was guaranteed. On the 21st of March 1940, Paul Reynaud became France's Prime Minister. 2 years earlier, as Minister of Finance, he had effected major improvements in the French economy. Aged 62, he now found himself at the head of a government and a country that had long been torn by bitter political divisions. Militarily, he was a hardliner against Germany and wanted France to adopt a more aggressive attitude. Upon taking office, he immediately cooperated with Britain in planning and executing the Allied intervention in Norway. Yet time and again, Reynaud's initiatives were blocked by his numerous enemies. He was also at loggerheads with his senior military commanders. He had long argued, though without success, for the formation of armored corps in the French army. The eve of the German offensive found Reynaud's government virtually paralyzed by disunity. Before becoming Prime Minister in 1937, Neville Chamberlain had been Minister of Health and Chancellor of the Exchequer. He believed that peace in Europe could best be achieved by making concessions to Germany, even though he had a deep personal dislike of Hitler. It was a belief shared by many people in Britain, and when Chamberlain returned home after signing the Munich Agreement, he received a hero's welcome. But while appeasing Hitler on the political front, Chamberlain also oversaw British preparations for the possibility of war. In 1938, he introduced rearmament. The regular army received new weapons and vehicles, as well as improved salaries and living conditions. The Territorial Army Reserve was reorganized and expanded. Following Germany's takeover of Czechoslovakia, Chamberlain quickly introduced conscription and stepped up the pace of rearmament. He also arranged for the British Expeditionary Force to go to France in September 1939. His political standing, however, had been badly undermined by his earlier policy of appeasement. He had also spurned Russian offers of an alliance, thus paving the way for the Nazi-Soviet pact. His political fate would be sealed by the defeat of the Allied expedition in Norway. On the first day of the German offensive in the West, Chamberlain would be forced to resign. The man who would replace him had been one of his sternest opponents and an arch critic of appeasement. At the outbreak of war, Winston Churchill was First Lord of the Admiralty. He was one of Britain's most experienced politicians, having held 8 cabinet positions in a 40-year career interspersed with frequent spells in the political wilderness. In 1938, he had even considered retiring from public life. Churchill had been one of the fiercest critics of the pre-war policy of appeasement and was absolutely unshakable in his opposition to Hitler. He was largely responsible for planning and directing the Allied campaign in Norway, but escaped serious criticism for its failure. In spite of his great experience, Churchill was only a compromise choice for Prime Minister. Though the support he received was less than wholehearted, he himself had complete self-belief. He would later remark that assuming the leadership felt like walking with destiny. Within a week of defeating Poland, Hitler had issued a directive stating that Germany should launch an attack against France through the Low Countries as quickly as possible. Hitler dismissed his general's objections to this order as defeatist and insisted on the operation going ahead. At once, the German High Command prepared their first plan for the Western Offensive, codenamed Case Yellow. Case Yellow gave the major role to the Army's right wing, Army Group B, which would overwhelm the Belgian forces along the line of the Albert Canal and then push towards the Somme. Army Group A, in the center, would attack through southern Belgium in support, while Army Group C held the Franco-German frontier in a largely static role. Case Yellow was virtually a repeat of the German invasion plan of 1914. Hitler had misgivings about this version of Case Yellow, noting that its proposed advance had to be made across difficult terrain. Worse still, it seemed likely to lead to the sort of static war of attrition he had himself endured in the trenches of World War I. He suggested making an attack against the Allied center. Over the ensuing months, the High Command prepared several minor variations of Case Yellow, none of which quite satisfied him. In any case, the onset of winter forced Hitler to postpone his offensive time and again. The Germans now began studying a fifth and very different version of Case Yellow, known as sickle stroke. Sickle stroke required Army Group B, now much reduced in size, to attack Belgium and Holland. First, airborne troops would be parachuted into Rotterdam, where they would seize the aerodromes. Paratroops would also be used to secure bridges over Belgium's Albert Canal and to capture the vital fortress of Eben-Emael. Next, The Luftwaffe was to attack airfields in Belgium, Holland and France, destroying enemy aircraft before they even had a chance to take off. Finally, the main body of Army Group B was to commence its advance. Its main purpose was to lure the Franco-British forces into the Belgian lowlands. In the south, facing the formidable fixed defences of France's Maginot Line, Army Group C was to engage its defenders and effect a breakthrough if possible. The main effort was to be delivered by the strongest German force, Army Group A, in the centre, spearheaded by 7 armoured and 3 motorised divisions. Army Group A would attack across the dense forest of the Ardennes through Luxembourg and southern Belgium. Bypassing the Maginot Line, they were to cross the Meuse between Dinant and Sedan, then break out toward the Somme. By so doing, they would drive a huge wedge in the centre of the Allied armies. If all went to plan, Sickle-Stroke could yield a decisive victory. Its very boldness had deterred the High Command when it was first laid before them in November. Since then, there'd been time to perfect its details. When Sickle-Stroke was finally put to Hitler in February 1940, that same boldness appealed to him instinctively. Furthermore, Sickle-Stroke was in line with his own earlier suggestion that an attack might be possible against the Allied centre. Its adoption was thus assured. From that point on, all the deliberations and preparations of the General Staff were geared entirely towards its successful realization. For months on end, its every aspect was carefully rehearsed in elaborate training exercises. By May the 10th, 1940, every German soldier, from the highest rank to the lowest, knew exactly what was expected of him if victory was to be achieved. France's principal system of defense was the Maginot Line. The line was an extensive bulwark of fortifications deemed impossible to breach. This elaborate defensive network contained numerous tank traps, mines, fortified machine gun emplacements, anti-tank, anti-aircraft and heavy field artillery. The forts were all linked by connecting lifts and tunnels. They could supply their own needs of water and power, and the largest could accommodate a garrison of 1,000 men. France had spent a staggering 7,000 million francs in building the Maginot Line, by far the greater part of her overall defense budget. Due to the strength of the Maginot defences, French strategists were certain the Germans would have to repeat their 1914 attack through Belgium and Holland. However, in planning how to meet this threat, they were immediately faced with the problem of Belgian neutrality. The Belgians were afraid of provoking Germany by being seen to align themselves with Britain and France. They were also worried that a close alliance with France would antagonize their Flemish population, who harbored strong anti-French sentiments. They therefore pursued a policy of strict neutrality. Allied troops were forbidden to enter Belgium unless the country was actually attacked. they were denied the chance of familiarizing themselves with the terrain, or even of learning the battle plans of the Belgian army. Eventually, the Allies developed the strategy known as the Deal Plan, or Plan D. Once the Germans attacked, the French 1st and 7th Armies and the BEF, the most mobile Allied forces, would advance into Belgium and occupy a line running from Antwerp to Namur along the Deal River. Here, they hoped to link up with the Belgian army. To their right, the French 9th Army would deploy along the River Meuse, from Namur to the French border. In March 1940, the modification known as the Breda variant was added. This required the French 7th Army on the left to proceed even further, to Breda, so as to form a continuous Allied Dutch-Belgian front. South of this, the French 2nd Army Group was to man the Maginot Line. And in the center of the Allied position, a small covering force of 5 divisions would be stationed behind the Ardennes forest. Because the Ardennes was considered impassable, no anti-tank or anti-aircraft weapons were given to these troops. To the north, both Belgium and Holland had evolved their own independent strategies to counter a German invasion. Belgium's first line of defense ran along the Albert Canal. Its linchpin was the formidable Fort Ebony Mail, and there were fieldworks with machine gun posts every 500 to 800 yards. But the Belgians did not expect to be able to hold this line for long. They subsequently planned to fall back on a line from Antwerp to Namur, known as the KW line. The same line that the French would advance to as part of their Deal Plan. Since November 1939, they had been fortifying this sector, and by May of the following year had erected hundreds of pillboxes along it, a small percentage of which were earmarked for occupation by the French and British. The Dutch, too, had decided to defend only part of their country. This was the vital economic area located between the 3 large rivers of the Meuse, Waal, and Rhine. The Dutch army was to fight delaying actions on the Grebbe line, and would then withdraw and resort to the traditional tactics of deliberate flooding to impede the enemy. The Allies' prospects of repelling the German invasion would depend entirely on factors beyond their control. Firstly, the Belgians would have to delay the Germans long enough for the Allies to occupy the Deal line. Next, there would have to be perfect coordination between the various forces. This coordination would have to be worked out in the very heat of battle. Above all, the Germans would have to attack precisely where the Allied strategists expected they would. The commander-in-chief of the German army was General Walter von Brochich. 58 years old, he was a decorated veteran of the First World War, an excellent linguist and student of world affairs. A highly intelligent officer, he was Hitler's personal choice to become commander-in-chief in 1938. However, he lacked the strength of character to stand up to Hitler. Like many of his colleagues, Brohich doubted the wisdom of launching a Western offensive. When he voiced these doubts to Hitler, he was so fiercely berated, he never again dared to question the Führer's directives. In November 1939, Brohich was presented with the first draft of the sickle-stroke plan. Its author was Lieutenant General Fritz Erich von Manstein, one of the keenest operational minds in the German army. Brohich thought sickle-stroke unfeasible and dismissed it. But Manstein kept lobbying for its acceptance until at last Brohich lost patience and transferred him to a command in the east. Soon afterwards, in February, Manstein met Hitler and described his plan to him. The very next day, Brohich was ordered to adopt sickle-stroke, which the Führer presented as his own idea. Over the following weeks, as he oversaw the rehearsals for sickle-stroke, Brohich himself came to appreciate its potential. His troops had also benefited from months of training and reorganizing. Despite his cautious nature, Brohich felt the army at last had a real chance of victory. The supreme commander of the Allied forces in France was General Maurice Gamelin. He was aloof and felt ill at ease amongst his troops. He preferred to spend his time at his headquarters, cut off from the men. In May 1940, Gamelin's command was made up of 4 operational areas. The most important of these was in the northeast, facing Germany. Gamelin retained direct control of planning and strategy, leaving his frontline commanders in charge of operations and liaisons with each other. It was a desperately flawed command structure, characterized by inefficient coordination and communication. To make matters worse, Gamelin had fallen out with his key commanders. The BEF commander, Lord John Gort, was disturbed by the blatant weakness of the French command structure, but as he was subordinate to Gamelin, he could do little about it. Gamelin had been a staff officer during the First World War, and the strategies of that era still dominated his outlook. He believed that infantry still reigned supreme on the battlefield. He discounted the idea that tanks, on their own, could breach a continuous line of defense. As the lessons of the Polish campaign were pondered, he confidently asserted that his forces could contain and cut off any possible breakthrough by panzers. Gamelin's passive strategy infuriated France's new Prime Minister, Paul Reynaud, who called him a nerveless philosopher. Twice in April, and again on the very eve of the German invasion, he tried to have Gamelin dismissed. However, each time the general's political supporters had stepped in to save him. France's fate would now rest in his hands. Germany had mustered 136 divisions for its assault on France. No more than a third were fully experienced and equipped, and these would all be committed in the attack's first wave. In spite of Blitzkrieg's reliance on mobile forces, the army was far from being entirely motorized and had only 120,000 trucks. Many of its guns still had to be horse-drawn. Because Germany lacked the military and industrial resources for a long war, it needed swift victories. Blitzkrieg provided the method by which such victories could be secured. It required the close cooperation of all arms, especially between the Army and Air Force. To achieve this, Luftwaffe ground crews accompanied the panzer divisions to help coordinate air and ground attacks. At the war's outbreak, the Luftwaffe was Europe's largest and most powerful air force. Its planes were deployed in semi-autonomous fleets, the aerial equivalent of panzer divisions. The Luftwaffe largely functioned in a sophisticated army support role, typified by such planes as the highly effective Stuka dive bomber. Because most of its planes were short-range, the Luftwaffe needed to occupy and operate from captured enemy airfields. Over 4,000 Luftwaffe planes would take part in the Battle of France, giving it a numerical superiority of almost 2-to-1 over the Allied air forces. By May 1940, German panzer strength stood at over 2,500 machines. Individually, the German tanks held no clear advantage in either armor or firepower, but their deployment in armored divisions guaranteed them battlefield superiority at the point of contact. Each armored division included about 240 tanks, as well as supporting vehicles. These divisions would have a decisive and dramatic influence in the coming conflict. The Panzer II was first produced in 1935. It featured a new suspension system using 5 large, independently sprung road wheels. Though heavier than the Panzer I, it was also faster and more powerful. "955 Panzer IIs would be committed in the battle for France, almost half of the Army's total tank strength. Its 20mm cannon was a converted aircraft gun and would be no match for many of the Allied tanks. It was essentially a lightly armed scout tank. The Panzer III was intended as Germany's main battle tank and was expected to make up 75% of an armored division's strength. It was primarily designed to fill an anti-tank role and was equipped with the same anti-tank gun that was used by the infantry. Problems in development meant that only 350 were available at the beginning of the Western offensive. The Panzer III had 6 small road wheels per side, each independently sprung on a torsion bar. Very little of its suspension system was exposed to enemy weapons. However, difficulties with rough terrain caused this type of suspension to be abandoned in later models. In 1938, it was decided to upgrade the Panzer III's main gun to 50mm, but this new model was not ready when the offensive began. During the course of the campaign, 40 up-gunned Panzer IIIs were to see action. The Panzer IV was designed as an infantry support tank and equipped with a short, low-velocity gun firing high explosive shells. It was designed to deal with enemy infantry and anti-tank guns. Its suspension system was a simple bogie arrangement using quarter-elliptical springs. Though first planned in 1935, it wasn't until 1939 that the Panzer IV finally came off the production line. Though intended to make up 25% of an armoured division's strength, the 278 tanks which fought in France constituted only 2% of total German armoured strength. With gun changes, it was to be the mainstay of the Panzer force throughout the war. The Panzer 38T was originally a Czech tank and had been the mainstay of the Czech army. An excellent, well-armoured light tank, it came into German possession with the occupation of Czechoslovakia in 1939. Over 400 38Ts took part in the Western Offensive. In just 7 years, the German army had grown from 100,000, the figure permitted by the Versailles Treaty, to a grand total of 3.5 million. Of these, 2.5 million would be committed to the Western Offensive. A large percentage of German troops were conscripts, drafted from the brown shirts, the police, and elsewhere. By May 1940, the army's morale could not have been higher. To the earlier bloodless conquests of Austria and the Czechs, they could now add their well-fought victories in Poland and Norway. These campaigns gave the ordinary German soldier complete confidence in his training, equipment, and leadership. The German troops were well paid and received generous home leave, factors which further boosted their morale. Though discipline was strict, relations between the men and their officers were very good, and a strong spirit of comradeship was fostered throughout the army. Alongside the regular army, Germany would field 3 divisions of the Waffen-SS, totaling 100,000 men. It had been founded in March 1939 as the military wing of the Nazi Party's elite SS. The SS were the first German units to train with live ammunition and to be issued with camouflage jackets. SS divisions were all motorized. Highly organized and fanatically loyal to Hitler, they were intended to be used as shock troops. Although Hitler was intensely proud of these, his personal regiments, the Waffen-SS were initially mistrusted by the army, who regarded them as amateur soldiers. However, they fought well in Poland, thereby earning a reputation for courage and discipline. In the battle for France, Germany would field a highly organized and motivated fighting force. By May 1940, 94 French divisions, containing 2.25 million men, were deployed to meet the expected German attack. However, much of their artillery dated from the First World War, and they were dangerously short of effective anti-tank and anti-aircraft guns. French and British tactical doctrine regarding tanks and aircraft lagged far behind the Germans. Both the high commands considered tanks as first and foremost an infantry support weapon. The few French armoured divisions formed by 1940 contained only half as many tanks as their German counterparts. Between them, the Allies deployed 3,100 tanks in May 1940, but they were widely dispersed amongst the infantry divisions. As for the French Air Force, it could field only 740 modern fighters and 140 effective light or medium bombers. These were reinforced by 350 aircraft from Britain's RAF, attached to the BEF. The Allied aircraft were dispersed amongst the different areas of the front in just the same way as the armoured forces were. This made it impossible for individual army commanders to obtain a sufficient concentration of air power at the right moment. This shortcoming would be one of the major factors in the outcome of the Battle of France. The French Army's standard light tank from 1935, the R-35, was used in an infantry support role. 855 R-35s equipped the Army in May 1940, making it France's most numerous tank. Extremely slow, it was unsuitable for mobile strategic operations. Like all French tanks, its effectiveness was limited by the fact that its commander had also to act as gunner, loader, and radio operator. First developed in the mid-1930s, the Char B was a formidable weapon, with thicker armour than any Panzer. It mounted a 47mm gun in a revolving turret, backed up by a 75mm gun in the hull. Though limited by a short operating range of 85 miles, the Char B could cope with any German tank pitted against it. Like other French tanks, it was poorly deployed by the Army Command. The Matilda II would prove to be the best British tank in the Battle of France. It was one of the earliest tanks to have a hydraulically controlled turret. Designed purely for infantry support, its cross-country speed was little faster than walking pace. The Matilda was the best protected tank of its day, but it suffered somewhat from poor vision and mobility. During the interwar years, the French army was regarded as the most formidable in Europe. By 1939, this reputation no longer stood up to close scrutiny. Throughout the 1930s, recruitment had fallen and funding declined due to the Depression and the large costs of the Maginot Line. The troops received only 50 centimes a day, compared to a British private's daily allowance of 17 francs. This caused great resentment amongst the French rank and file. Their living conditions were uncomfortable and impoverished. Discipline was lax, with soldiers often neglecting to salute their officers, and even leaving their barracks each weekend without permission. Many of the officers did their level best to secure a posting far behind the lines, away from the dreariness and danger of the front. The winter of 1939 was the coldest in 50 years, making life at the front harsher still. Training and work routines were curtailed, which gave rise to idleness and then boredom. Amongst the BEF, where the officers insisted on keeping their men busy, morale was a good deal better. Their months of waiting were spent improving defence works and completing the training of the recently raised territorial army units. For the French soldiers, however, their army's ingrained defensive strategy added to its inertia and further sapped their fighting spirit. On May the 10th, the French army would go into battle with a fatal mix of apathy and disharmony. By the spring of 1940, there was a widespread belief amongst the French army that the war would be settled by diplomatic agreement, without a shot being fired. On May the 7th, normal leave was restored to the army. By now, relations between Paul Reynaud and General Gamelin had completely broken down, and on May the 9th, the French premier offered to resign because his government would not let him sack the general. In the wake of the Norwegian disaster, Britain's Prime Minister, Neville Chamberlain, was also preparing to resign. That same evening, the Luftwaffe informed Hitler, the weather on May the 10th will be good. Later that night, the code word Danzig went out to the already alerted German units, signaling that the long-awaited offensive would begin at 05:35 hours. The long-gathering storm was finally about to break.